So what I wanted to do today was walk through, this is going to be very much a flow focused talk, but I live a lot in SharePoint, and SharePoint connects in very easily with flow. So you're going to see a lot of SharePoint, you're going to see a lot of flow, aka Power Automate. Microsoft wanted to bring the naming conventions together for the Power Platform, and so flow is sort of the outlier, and so it's called Power Automate now. And you will see me use the terms interchangeably. However, I think of Power Automate as sort of the container in which you build flows. So I might refer to the process within Power Automate as a flow. I was going to build it all, and then I did a dry run with my team this morning, and it took way too long to try to build it by hand. And so it's pre-built, and so at least we know it works. And but I'm going to walk through the different components of it here for you. If there's questions or anything like that, Mark and I will try to keep an eye on the chat, and chat's over here for me, so I may not see it right away. If I'm going too fast, please let me know, and happy to delve into any particular areas that you need to. I might parking lot some things for later on if it's a little too detailed, but if something doesn't make sense, by all means, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, and I'm going to monitor the chat throughout the meeting.
Great. So the main things we're going to go through here are, I want to just talk about how it enables automating business processes, and I'm going to take a codeless approach. Now, there are areas where it might be beneficial to have some code running in Azure Function somewhere, and I'll call those out, but I intentionally didn't do them here, even in areas where I maybe normally would have been tempted to do so. So we'll show you how you connect Power Automate to Office 365 services as well as other services. We'll cover this sort of sub-process within Power Automate called approvals. Microsoft's built sort of a whole approvals product into here. And we'll connect it to some external services. And in this particular case, I'm also using a custom service. So I'll talk about how you can sort of build wrappers around services which maybe don't have pre-built connectors for Power Automate. I want to talk about best practices for managing your flows in a shared environment, so you don't have, you know, when you start to have a lot of these, there's some rules to play by for just making sure not everything's tied to your username, etc. And then if we have time at the end, I was going to touch on PowerApps just a little bit. I think there's going to be some upcoming sessions, so I'm not too worried about that. But if there's time, we can kind of go into that a little bit. So the main things I'm going to talk about, just sort of to level set here, is you're going to hear me use the terms connectors, triggers, and actions in here. So a connector is anything within Power Automate that can connect to another service. And I specifically mean a web service, but generally it's a collection of web services. So Office 365 has a whole bunch, but they're segmented by product. So you've got Outlook here, you've got SharePoint here, you've got OneDrive here. Or you're going to see some DocuSign in here as well. And then each connection that you make, so when you say, okay, I'm going to connect to SharePoint, then you, as the author, get to configure the authentication of that connector to that service. So if I authenticate it to my SharePoint environment as Chris, that flow, every time it executes, regardless of who causes it to execute, will talk to SharePoint as Chris. We'll talk about some best practices around that. So I can change that to a different account. A trigger is something that starts a flow. Generally, in the terms of a connector, that's where flow is now listening for some event to happen. Behind the scenes, there might be a webhook or something like that. There's also triggers where you can say you push a button, or you can have a trigger that runs every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 a.m. or a schedule of your choosing. But a trigger is what kicks off a flow. And then an action is something that happens after the trigger. So the trigger kicks off the flow. What happens next? Every step within that flow is to an external service is an action. So some of those best practices I mentioned, the one I advocate for the most is to try to use service accounts or generic accounts if you can to connect to services. So that way, if, me as Chris, if I, leave the company or switch out of the role and my permissions change, all of a sudden that flow doesn't break. So if I set everything up as Chris and then my role changes, my permissions change, Chris doesn't have access to the HR side anymore or whatever, then, or better yet, you probably don't want the developers to necessarily have access to the HR site in the first place. And so you'll want to use an account that's delegated for that so that it doesn't try to follow a user's life cycle. There are ways to send notifications from Flow. Most people just tend to use the Outlook connector, but again, that's going to be coming from Chris, and so you may want to have it come from a service account, but sometimes service accounts aren't named friendly, or you don't necessarily want to have a service account for every name of a flow that you want to say to people. So I often use shared mailboxes that have like the name of the site or the process that makes sense. So you know that an email, users will get used to an email coming from like the HR onboarding service. You can also assign multiple owners, but one thing you can do if it is a SharePoint list that is in the process there, you can actually assign a SharePoint list as an owner as well. And that way anybody who has permissions to that SharePoint list as an owner or I think even design view can come in and work with the flow. So you're not having to worry about assigning permissions. Some other best practices, smaller flows are easier to manage. Licensing is a different question, but it's easier to manage from a troubleshooting perspective. You can at the top of your flow, and I'll come back and demonstrate all of this, but you can set what's called a trigger condition so that you may say in a flow that this flow runs every time a SharePoint item is created. Well, that flow before they introduce trigger conditions, you would then have to evaluate whether you want to continue and then you could end. But that took up a run. So sometimes you're limited on number of runs or you just don't want it to run and take up resources. So now the trigger condition will prevent the flow from running altogether. All those ones where they were just running and ending created a lot of noise in the log, made it harder to troubleshoot things. And lastly, short-lived processes are easier to manage. So I like to have things that sort of, soup to nuts, will try to run, do a thing, and then go away. And then the next phase of that kicks up, it'll run and do a thing. Sometimes you need to have long-running processes, but Flow will time everything out at 30 days. So that's a design consideration. We recently built one for a client where a thing had to happen 3 weeks after this other thing, and we didn't. But that other thing could happen 2 weeks or 1 week after we started up. And so what one of our guys wanted to do was like sort of wait 2 weeks and then kick it off and then wait longer to try to get around the 30 days. What we did instead is we just sort of changed the design a little bit so that every day at 8 a.m. a flow ran, found all the things that were ready to go forward, and then just kicked off flows for those. So last PowerPoint before I dive into some actual stuff here. This is the process that I want to build for you today. And it's an example process of an HR coordinator getting ready to send an offer letter to a job candidate. So they will create an entry in a SharePoint list here with the job details and the candidate info. We're going to use a service, a word automation service that's going to automatically shoehorn that data into a template in a very dynamic sort of way. It's kind of nice. So it's not. I'll explain that when I get to it. The manager gets to review that, and we're going to see Microsoft, the flow approvals part there. And then I'm going to send it off to DocuSign, and the HR manager will sign the offer letter, and then DocuSign will automatically route it to the candidate. And if that candidate accepts it or declines it, the flow will respond accordingly. So that's the top flow. There is one flow, and then the whole thing stops until DocuSign says, hey, it's done. DocuSign then is going to send us a notification back via the DocuSign Connect engine. We're going to then update the request in Flow. We're going to update the SharePoint item and attach a PDF. And finally, we're going to send some notifications out. Now that in a real world scenario might not be the end of our process. At that point, we might then kick off the HR onboarding process where it provisions accounts. It might wait until their start date to do some certain things, or start date -5 or whatever, but we have sort of the sky's the limit from that point on, what we want to do with it. So a couple things I'm going to show here. This is my SharePoint list. And we can pretend, for the sake of pretending, that this list already existed before our process, and now we want to automate based on this. So if not, we can sort of train users that this is where they have to now come. The HR people have to come to enter that request. Collect the data here, and I'll come back in a second to show what that other part looks like. Within Flow, I wanted to show real quick these different connectors that are available. So these are all pre-built connectors that Power Automate has to connect to external services. And these aren't all just Microsoft services. You get Gmail in here, you know, Facebook, etc., Slack. Some of them are annotated with this premium, and that means you need to have a Power Automate premium license to use those. Not going to go down the rabbit hole, but the general gist is you can license where a user can use the premium connectors, or you can have it so that it's licensed by a certain number of flows. So you'll have to Bing or Google that to get a little more detail. I don't know it well enough to go into the rabbit hole. We are going to use some premium connectors today, though, because I thought it made for a better presentation. But there are ways to sort of work around them in certain instances where if you don't want to use a premium connector, you might be able to do something sort of the same way with a couple extra steps to work around it. In browsing these connectors, if you want to see what they do, we can click on an item, and it's going to show you what I mentioned before, where you have triggers and actions. So here's the different triggers that the SharePoint connector has. So you can say anytime an item is created or when an item is deleted. And there's different actions, not in this view, but it can then go and update an item in SharePoint, or it can attach a file to an item or delete an item or whatnot. So as I mentioned before, in here we've got two processes. The top row and the bottom row are two separate processes. So the first process is the one where we send that offer letter out and we get the approval along the way. I'm gonna just real quick show you what it looks like to create a flow, but I'm not gonna create that flow from scratch because it'll take a lot longer time than we have today. I mentioned you can have them where you just click a button or you schedule it. I'm gonna do an automated flow here, and we're gonna say something like when a file is created in OneDrive or when an item is created in a SharePoint list. And it automatically adds that trigger for you. You can delete this trigger if you need to and add a different one. But every flow starts with one and only one trigger. In this case, it's prompting me. It's making some web service calls behind the scenes, and it's prompting me for what site and list I want to connect to. Now, I mentioned before, I don't know why it's defaulting to this other user, but I don't want it to use this user one connection. I want it to use my connection, or I can add a new connection here, and I could connect in as that service account. So I'll say connect as me, and when I click the little drop down, it's going to pull and show. I'm in a free Office dev tenant here. I just named it Romp dev. So, and now we're going to have this site that I have really only has one list, and there we go. There's some additional options, usually advanced options that you can expand to adjust some things. But if they put them in here, they generally means you don't probably need them all of the time, but it's good to know if you're looking for something, that's where you look. I mentioned the trigger conditions. So under this menu here, if we go to settings, I can add, I'm not gonna go through all of this stuff, but I can add certain trigger conditions. So I can say, you know, you use these expressions, and there's a whole reference for those that you can look up. And there's an expression builder in most of the places here in Power Automate that you need an expression. Here there's not. And so what I'll usually do is if I need some help, I'll use the, you'll see it a little bit later on. I'll use one of those and I'll put it into Notepad and then come back here and paste it in. But I might say equals, and then I'll say trigger body, and then I'll say what, you know, let's say status, and I'll say the status is equal to new. And so now this will only run if this field status is set to new. Any other ones, it will not fire that event when the item is created. So that's all of that, and that's exactly where I started here. So I started out with that exact same shape. We said when a new item is created. But what I like to do right away is I like to come in and rename them. Now, not very long ago, once you used the output of any action or trigger elsewhere in your flow, you couldn't rename the flow anymore. And so it used to be really important to set a meaningful name here, and you'll see where this shows up later. It used to be really important to do it right away. It's still important in my opinion because it makes things a little bit easier later on, because if everything is just called update item, it's hard to necessarily know which is which. So I took that same when a new SharePoint item is created. I don't have any trigger conditions on here because I didn't need them. I do want it to run all the time, and I named it new offer letter request. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to go set the status on, I have a few different status values, and I think I have more in here than I really needed because I was just messing around with some stuff. But I immediately want to set that to pending approval so that when we put an item into this offer letters list, that anybody looking at it will see that pending approval right away. And so they'll know that the background process is doing its job. It's not important. It doesn't change how the process runs, but I like to do it. This is a action for the SharePoint connector called update list item. Now, when you update a SharePoint list item, all that you need to give the web service behind the scenes is its ID, and then you only need to give it fields that it's changing. There's this quirk with Power Automate where all of the required fields for that list item, it makes you include every single time you update it, which drives me mad, but that's the world we live in. So I had to give it the same properties for title, email, and job title, and I pulled those out of this. So what that looks like is anytime you click into a field, this dynamic content window will pop up, and if it doesn't, you can click here. And this shows me new offer letter request, which is what this is called, and this shows me all of the outputs from that trigger action. Additionally, I have this expression builder, and that's what I mentioned before. So if I needed to change the title here to something, I could even concatenate a couple of things, and then you can add some dynamic content, and I could concatenate the title, and then I could say in progress. And this is just like an Excel function. That's an important thing to mention, is you're going to see a lot of Excel-like functionality, both in Power Automate and PowerApps. Someone told me PowerApps was built by the Excel team. It feels kind of like it was. Power Automate, it wouldn't surprise me if they were sort of going for this, a similar thing. But regardless, I don't need to do anything with this, but I do need to give it its title again. So it's the same item. I got the ID from this shape, and I have to give it the title again. Why? I don't know. So sometimes it gets a little weird. Scroll down and click title, and it goes in. Hopefully, you know, for most people, that's as complicated as you ever get. Some of our expressions will get a little fancy later on. The next thing I want to do is I want to have a formatted version for the salary. It's kind of cool that this shape exists. This is a pretty new action format where I can take a number and format as a currency. It seems like a little thing. They have built-in expressions for formatting dates and other types of data, but they didn't have a thing for formatting the salary. So the way you worked around this before is you'd either use a SharePoint column. I have an Azure function that formats salary that I call from my older flows, and I was going to use that to demonstrate the custom connector here. And then I found they already had one built in, and so I'm using it. Although right before we came in, the flow didn't run, and it was because of the shape. So your mileage may vary. It could be that they're still working out some bugs on it. But all that this does is this takes in that number for the salary and a format string, or you can use a more traditional format string if you needed to, which would be something like this or this for no dollars. But the documentation for this, if you need it in the help docs, does say it does take .NET standard formatting strings, and C0 means currency with 0 decimal places. So we've run through these first two actions so far. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the offer letter. This is a premium connector. This is using a word automation service. And what the word service does here, let's see here, Word. I'll pull it up just so you can see Word online, is you get two actions from this connector. One is convert Word document to PDF. That's kind of cool. The other is populate a Microsoft Word template. Interesting. So what I've done here is I have a library in my site called templates, and I just put in an offer letter template in here. And what I've done is I've inserted fields into these. Now, the nice thing about this is if you've worked with something like DocuSign before, DocuSign, and I'll come to the DocuSign fields in a second, but DocuSign will put a tag in a particular place. And so if you're going to have text go into a spot in a document, you have to leave enough room for that to be in there, but it's going to be like, it's always going to look kind of funny. So it would look something like there'd be a big space, there'd be a lot of spaces around it, and then the font never quite matches up, and so it ends up looking a lot like this. But I don't want that. And the nice thing about this Word inserting these into these fields is this will dynamically adjust to make the text continue to flow just as if you typed it in there. So I like that, and it works out pretty well here. The next thing is I've got a couple of things in here that I've got in here as placeholders for the DocuSign. It's missing a character there, so I wonder if that's going to work. I've got a couple of placeholders in there for DocuSign to know to put its tags in, and that way if you like have a long job description and everything ends up moving down a bunch of rows, that DocuSign will still put the signature blocks and the title blocks and all that in the right place. It's kind of a cool feature. So just in case I messed that up, I'm going to go ahead and copy it from my computer back in there real quick. Let's try that again. No, it's because I have it open on my computer. All right. So back in Power Automate land, what I did is I said, okay, I want to hook into this SharePoint site. Power Automate also lets you hook into OneDrive for Business or other things like that. I want to pull it from this document library, and the file is called offer letter. And those fields, it automatically read them out of the document where I had a field for candidate name, job title, location, salary, all of that. And so Power Automate just automatically prompts me for those pieces of data because those are fields that were already inserted into the document. So we've gone from having a request to just getting some data, setting a status, creating a letter, and now we're going to route this to the manager for approval.
So Chris, we've got a question from Elena, and
yeah.
It's about converting Word to PDF, if you see in the chat.
Yeah, it doesn't appear that they, let's see what that looks like. I don't actually know. I'm not using it here. So we've got this OneDrive for Business. So if I click convert a Word document to a PDF, it seems to ask me for, okay. So what this does is this is going to read in that Word document the same as I did up here where I select a site or a connector of some kind. So I can say, you know, I want you to connect to OneDrive or different SharePoint sites, and then give it a library and a file. And what that does is then it creates, inside of the flow, there is the data for a PDF. And at this point, it only exists within there. Now, what you can do with it from there is you can write it out to SharePoint, you can write it out to OneDrive, you can attach it to an email, you can send it to another service, I could send it to DocuSign. So those bytes exist here inside of the flow for that PDF. You'll actually see an example of that, not from this connector, but when the DocuSign signature is all done, it'll send it to us.
Yeah, so I think that there's a licensing question that's part of this where her team does not have OneDrive access.
You don't need OneDrive for this, but this is a premium connector.
Oh, okay.
So you could tell Flow to go get a document from somewhere, and a Word document, and convert it to a PDF. So maybe you first take it as, you know, an offer letter or something, but yeah, so premium's the barrier. So like I said before, just do a little Google foo on this, but you can license premium per user. So the author who creates the flow and adds the connector needs their premium. You can also license them as per flows, where it doesn't matter how many users. I'm not sure, only in certain scenarios would that make sense to me. But yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay, so we've come this far, and now we're going to route this for manager approval. So there's a whole lot of stuff out here, and I'll put a link to this in the where is it here? Power Automate. Is this the? I had the approvals out here. I didn't name my shortcuts very well. I'll put a link to this in the PDF document, but they have a whole bunch of different approval flows that are available with this. It's got things like routing rules and all that. I don't think it's quite up to like what an Intex or K2 does at this point, but it's still not half bad. Now, approvals, last I read, need to be all internal participants. If you need to send an approval to an external participant, there's another option called email with options, where it gives people like clickable options and you can name them whatever you like. And those will go through, those you can send to external recipients. But this one, there's different rules for like everyone must respond, first to respond, etc. So we just give it a title and assign it to somebody, and you can assign it to multiple people. It'll send it out. And then we have a little bit of markdown formatting in here, and I just put the details down here. One other thing that I did though is I'm attaching a file, and the content of that file is the output from our create offer letter. So this isn't like a file now. This file content doesn't live anywhere except inside of this flow right now. So I have the bytes for that living in here, and we do end up using it in 2 different places, but this is the first place we use it. So with that, let's just go through this first part. Let's fire this off and see what happens. I'm trying to decide the best way I want to do this. I want to leave that one up so I can look at it, but I also want to watch this. So we're going to go over here, and within this offer letter here, I'm just going to go ahead. Mark, you going to be our candidate?
Okay, I'm always looking for something to do.
I don't have Mill Valley on my list. San Francisco's close enough.
Sure.
You report to me, I'm sad to say. How much you want to get paid for this?
What is the maximum allowable?
Yeah, it's probably the maximum bound for an integer. So so here's our annual salary.
Just put lots of zeros at the end, okay?
I'll just do this. I'll do this so we can see a number get formatted.
Okay.
And then the start date is, come on, we'll make it today. Why not? I'm going to go ahead and click save. So that's all I've done from the HR coordinator role standpoint. And what we ought to see here in a second is we ought to see this status flip over. There it goes, automatically went to pending approval. And I heard a little email sound. Now let's go over here, and I'm going to refresh this send offer letter, and we can see this is still running. And this is not a bad interface to troubleshoot this, and I'll show you why. So here's what our design view looks like, where we came in and configured all these shapes. But here's what the runtime view looks like for this. Real quick, I can cancel. I can go into edit mode for the flow. If it was all done, I can hit resubmit. So if something broke, you can change it, come in, resubmit it. It's really nice. But if I look at this new offer request here, it comes in and it shows me both my inputs, but then also shows me my outputs. So here's the information I got from SharePoint. That item ID was 7. Here's mark, G, the status, all the different pieces of data that we care about for that item are available in here. And this makes troubleshooting much nicer. If you ever to work with like SharePoint workflows or God help you BizTalk workflows, it was not necessarily this easy to come in and see what everything looked like at a point in time. So real quick, I said pending approval. This looks almost exactly the same as the other thing did. Format salary, we know we put in that 123456 number, and I gave it a currency string of this, and it spit out this nicely formatted number, currency with no decimal points. So this is less important. This is just, I guess, what Word tagged those fields as for certain IDs as we hit that service. But here's the different pieces of data that went into that. Now, what does that look like? It created an approval for us. It doesn't show us much here, but this one's still running. So we don't know what's going on here, but it did send me an email. So I'm gonna go ahead and look at my email here, and we see our heading to formatted and bullet list with all the details in here. I do like the Word web interface because you can do things like view your document in line. So you can say, we are pleased to offer you the role of user group organizer, and notice it pushed this out, and so it's the next line. So it's not that big gap with the weird text in there. It formatted it very nicely, and then brought these down for us. So I think that's gonna mess up my DocuSign thing, but I'll deal with that later. I made these tags so you can still see them, only just to illustrate them, but these can be white tags later on. So I can come in, if I need to reject it, you know, maybe the starting date was wrong or something like that, I can make those notes here. And if I look back at the flow, once it's all done here, I do come in and I look at the response, and I do notify the requester that it was not, so the hiring manager did not approve it, and then here's the comments that that hiring manager made. But for the sake of user group, you know, we're gonna go ahead and submit that. And this is really all done from this perspective. So if we go back to our running Power Automate, we can now see the manager approval. And the main thing we care about here is this approval outcome. I do have, as well if I need to, I do have the approval detail in here, that comment, where is it? It's in here somewhere. I know it's available. It is available to me to use later on if I need to. So the next action just verifies the output of this approval action. Now, it may look kind of strange. Why did I format? Why is this yes shape empty? And this is just really a personal preference. I could have had everything else that took place in this. I could have shoved it into this yes block. But when you come in here, all you see is this, and that would be the end of it. So it's like, oh, okay, well, what does it do next? And so then you expand this, and you've got the yes and no, and then you have to expand those, and then expand those, and it's really hard. If I'm making a decision in a flow as to whether or not to continue, my preference is to say, to make the decision, and if, you know, the yes is end, I end there, and if it's no, I end here. And so what I'll do is I'll do my thing, and then I tell it, go ahead and terminate, and the status is cancel. So what's next? So once it's gone through and done this, I have this other shape in here called create and send template. So this is where I'm going to break off a little bit and talk about a custom connector. So in here, I'm using DocuSign. And DocuSign does have some connectors. They're premium, but it's got some connectors. I didn't use it for two reasons. One, I wanted to show off the custom connectors a little bit. And two, I wanted to use the sandbox account at DocuSign. So I wanted to log into the demo one, and they don't have one. So this way it's free. They don't have one for a flow connector for the sandbox. There's some documentation that says they do. I couldn't make it work. And these don't do exactly the same thing I'm doing in one step here. I could do it with this one with multiple steps, but so what I did here is if I go into data and then I look at custom connections, it's going to list all the custom connections that you've built. So you can come in here and you can build a new one. I won't go into the details of these different ones, but if you've got an Azure service, it's got some easy ways of automatically hooking them up. If you've got what's called an open API file, also known as a Swagger file, you can load that in here. It's friendly to Swagger version 2, I think. I don't know if it does version 3, Postman, etc., but I just created from blank. And with any service, the first thing, oops, not download. With any service, the first thing you want to do is talk about, well, you give it a name here and tell it what you're talking to. You can give it an icon, whatever you want to do. But generally speaking, the first thing I'm concerned with is how do we authenticate to it? So you can authenticate to this a number of ways. You can tell it, you can give it like an API token. You can tell it that there's no authentication. You can set it up for a username and password. And these are things that the flow author generally, but optionally, would provide. You can hard code them in here as well. So I've set this up to use OAuth based on you know, the configuration that is in the DocuSign API guide. I don't know why it doesn't show some of the properties here. Like there is a refresh URL, there is a client ID. I guess they don't show that for privacy reasons, but they could have just blurred it out. But trust me, it's there. And then we go into the definition, and this is where we add. Remember what I said before is we have triggers and we have actions. So I can define both of those here. Now, real quick, let me jump out into different ways to connect to custom services. So in this case, like I said, the DocuSign connector didn't do it exactly the way I wanted, and I wanted to show a custom connector anyway. Now, if I was just building this one time as sort of a one-off, and I didn't necessarily have to make it so that other users could use it, you can use what's just called an HTTP request shape. And this lets you put a shape into your flow, which says, call this URL with this payload, and it can be dynamic from other pieces of data that you've gathered in your flow. Quick and easy. When I just need to do something really fast, this is sort of my go-to here. But it's not very reusable in that I can't build it and then someone else can just put in the right pieces of data, then use it again in another flow. But they're very fast and easy to build. So the other way is the custom connector here. It's configured by an administrator. It puts parameters around this, and it's easier for reuse. Now, both the HTTP request and the custom connectors are premium connectors. Kind of irks me. But this is what that looks like, is you give it an ID, you give it the URL. Now, I am putting in here a parameter within my URL, so it knows that it needs to bring this in and use that to build out the URL. And the data that it then sends to, and I'm not going to go into all the detail here about what these different things mean, but this is where you define the data that needs to be sent to that service. And the way that that ends up looking to a user is in here. So we know that we're collecting the account ID. I could make this a drop down where it says, okay, based on your login, Chris, which accounts do you have access to, and then gives you a drop down, and then that way the user doesn't have to type this in. So there are ways to make it much friendlier than what I'm showing here. But the main things I wanted to parameterize around this are around the account ID and the email subject, the document that we created before, and then who the recipients are within DocuSign. So I've got this recipient role that's an HR coordinator, and I'm gonna, for lack of a better user in this demo, I'm just putting the manager back in there again. And then the candidate, and that's the person that we added to from our, I don't know if you can see it there, it says trigger body email, and that is the email field from right here. So I'm assigning those to roles that I've defined within my DocuSign template. Now, once it sends that, I come back here and I update that SharePoint item again, and I set the status to sent. Again, I didn't need to change the title, email, and job title, but it's making me put those data in there. And then I'm giving it the envelope ID, which comes from this create and send template. So if we look at the one I just ran, we came through here, I approved it, so it never fired this, and that's why you see these X's here. And then it continues down. It sent that template out to DocuSign, and it returned back this envelope ID. So I've gone back into our offer letters, and I've populated the envelope ID with that GUID that came back, and our status is sent. So if the HR coordinator comes in here, they know that that's been sent out. So what did DocuSign do with that? Let's find out. So DocuSign sends me a little email. If any of you ever bought a house, you probably know DocuSign. Oh, I did pick up the tags, good. And so it says, Dear Mark, here's that letter. Throws us on here because this is our sandbox account. But this is the HR manager is the first person to sign this. So it sent this to the my Chris account, And I'm going to go ahead and sign this as myself with the title of HR Manager. The other user on here is this test user, and they have not received an email yet because the template was configured to not send it to the candidate until the HR manager has had a chance to review and sign off on this. One of the nice things about DocuSign, I could have built this process where the users were coming into SharePoint, but then you kind of have, it's kind of weird to get users that don't have accounts in your domain into your SharePoint and all of that. So something like having to sign a document, DocuSign or Adobe EchoSign or any of those kinds of e-signature services was kind of a no-brainer because it's much easier to get an external participant into that workflow, and it has its own sort of workflow engines for, or rules for, can they reassign it? Does this expire? Can, you know, voiding and notifications. And so this did a lot of the building for me. Now, would it be worth getting DocuSign for just this? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. So let's go ahead and finish this. And I'm all done there. And now DocuSign behind the scenes is going to send an email to our candidate, the test user. And this is, hey, Mark, please DocuSign this letter. So we come in here. Now again, I have different options here. I can decline to sign if this isn't the right thing, or maybe call up the HR manager and be like, hey, I thought we said 124,000 on her, you know. But let's go ahead and pretend everything's great. I'm going to sign on behalf of you, Mark. Hope you don't mind. I'm not buying a house for you, though. And there we go. So DocuSign emails back, hey, your document's all done, but let's see what happens in Flow here. So which one is it? Oh yeah, going back to our PowerPoint here, I'm going to show something is that I split these into two different processes because I don't know how long it's going to take everybody to sort of, you know, do their e-signature process. So I let that flow go to sleep and I let something else happen. So one thing that's kind of nice, I've worked with DocuSign for like 10 years. They are one of my favorite APIs ever, because maybe that's just because I know it, but they have a service called Connect, which you can configure to push all events to you. That's probably not the best approach. It was the easiest one for the demo here. One thing you can do is when you create and send a DocuSign envelope, which is a collection of documents for signature, when you send an envelope, you can specify as a property on that envelope a callback URL. So I could have gotten a little bit fancier in my custom connector and given it the flow connection to come back. And that way DocuSign is only telling me about specific documents that I care about and not necessarily every document that comes out. A third option, which is less ideal, is polling for that. And so I could have spun up another flow that basically says, okay, once an hour, go check and see if that document is done. You can only poll a document every 15 minutes, and it's the least efficient approach of all of those. One thing that's kind of cool here is DocuSign does have a connector into OneDrive where it would just send the thing to OneDrive, and then you could have a flow look for OneDrive in that folder, and then that could continue on. But let me show you what this looks like here real quick. So I gave it the URL for flow. I'll show you where this comes from in a second. And then I told it I want to know all the terminal statuses for the envelope. So I want to know when it's signed or completed. I want to know when it's declined or voided. I don't care about send or delivered because I'm not necessarily trying to track the entire life cycle of this thing. I don't need to know about every individual recipient. But if I wanted to have this say, okay, well, the HR has approved it, now we're waiting on the candidate, I could do that with this here. So there's a lot of other features here, but basically, DocuSign just knows to send these statuses to this flow. So let's see what that looks like. So I have this shape called when an HTTP request is received. And normally, if this is going to send what's called JavaScript object notation, JSON, you can give it an example of it, and it will break those out into different parameters that you can reference later on. DocuSign, unfortunately, it's been around a little while, but it's still sending XML. So the thing I mostly care about here when it sends me this document is I care about this status flag. So I want to check the status. And then if the status is good, Then I want to come back and get this envelope ID and continue on. So I tell it that it's going to send a body with just one parameter, and that parameter is of type string. It's not a number, it's not a date, it's just string. But what we can do with that is I'm using a little bit of some expression magic here to convert. Let me put this into somewhere it's a little more readable. So I'm calling a couple of nested functions here. And if you've ever gotten real fancy in Excel, this isn't too scary. But I'm taking that trigger body, which is the output body from this, and I'm converting it to an XML document. And then with that XML document, I'm calling an XPath function. Just as a quick aside here, there are lots of functions and expressions in Power Automate. Microsoft has done a pretty good job of documenting these and giving examples and whatnot. So you need to get the UTC date, or you need to format a thing, or whatever. So I'll include this reference, a link to this reference guide in here. But it has an XPath function, and XPath is how you query XML for specific values. Now, my gut instinct would have been to just throw an Azure function up real quick and have it parse and send the data back to me, so I don't have to parse XML. And I would have had DocuSign Connect send that to the Azure function, and I would have had the Azure function call flow. I didn't want to write code here because I said I wasn't going to write code, but that's what we're doing here. Is I'm using this XPath expression in here to read the DocuSign envelope information /status, or envelope status /status. So I read that out and I convert it to a string instead of an array of data. So what that does is then I say, okay, if this read status value, so if the output here says outputs read status, if it's equal to completed, voided, or declined, then my flow cares about it. If it's not equal to completed, voided, or declined, it's not a terminal status and I don't care. So if it's not equal to any one of those things, we just end. I don't care. Now, I did configure DocuSign here to only send me completed, declined, or voided. So in theory, we shouldn't get there, but you never know. So if it is one of those things, I read the envelope ID, and then we go back to SharePoint and I say, I query for SharePoint items. Now, SharePoint has the ability to go and query for items based on a filter. It doesn't have the ability to query for one item, but you can tell it to give me items back and only give me the top one based on your filter. So you can query for items and filter and sort and all of that and tell it to give you back. But this is still, as far as flow is concerned, a collection of items, even though it's only a collection of one, but that matters here in a second. So what we did is I went back here and I said, give me the offer letters SharePoint items where the envelope ID is equal to blank, and I passed that value in. Give me only one of them, and there should only be one of them. So then I want to make sure that we actually have an offer letter request that's got that envelope ID, because if I'm using this, if I'm using DocuSign for other things, the way that this is currently set up, DocuSign is going to send me stuff for purchase orders and NDAs and those other kinds of things. But if I can't find the offer letter, then we're done. I don't need to continue any further, and I can tell the flow, you're all done here, thank you very much. I do have this compose shape that's translating the offer stats, and so I want to change status of completed to accepted. This if function works exactly the way it does in Excel. So I'm passing in a true false. Here's the value if it's, or here, this is the equals. Here's the value if it's true. Here's the value if it's false. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying if the status is equal to completed, I want the output of this shape to be accepted. Otherwise, I just want it to be whatever the status is. And what that matters for is if I look at the different, oh, I hit it on here. If I look at the different statuses available on here, completed is not one of them. And DocuSign, when it's completed, sends me the word completed, but completed means they accepted it. So I want to change that to the word accepted. but declined and voided, I've already got in here statuses, but you could map that out if you needed to do something different. I create the document, I read the document name, and then I read the document bytes out. And what you can do in that connect option here is I tell it to include the document PDFs. And so connect sends me all this data, but at the very end, it sends me a base 64 encoded string, which is all of the bytes of that document. So much like in the first flow where we had the bytes in memory for the Word document, now we have the bytes in memory for the signed PDF. So I told it to do a thing with it then, but anytime I use the output of this query, remember I said it's a collection of one, but it's still a collection. Anytime I use the output of this, Flow wants to put it into a loop. In this case, so by default, it'll call it apply to each, and it's going to use each value from get offer by envelope ID. So it's going to use every item in that collection, and it's going to run this once per. Now, if I wanted this to not be inside of this loop, there's a way to get the first item for each of these parameters, and then it won't worry about that. But the trade-off here was it didn't provide a whole lot of value. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set I'm once again updating that SharePoint item, and I'm taking the output of that offer status. So we set the status to it, and then I am adding an attachment to that item with the content from the document bytes, which we parsed out of that XML. So let's go look at our item here. Here it is. It's at the status to accepted, and if I come in, I see that we now have an attachment, and if I open up that attachment, this is our signed document, all done and ready. Finally, it will come in here and it sends an email out and says, the job offer for user group organizer is accepted by Mark G, and then I just put in a link to the item. But from this point on, we can do sort of whatever we want. We can kick off other onboarding processes. We can, you know, HR systems, IT systems, all of that. And that was that notify manager and requested, and then we're all done. So just a real quick show what that looked like. Was that really 10 minutes ago? All right, so it came in, it received the request, it read that status out. The condition was true, so we didn't terminate. It read our ID, it updated the ID, it made sure, sorry, it queried by the envelope ID, it found that offer, then we parsed out what the status was, we parsed out the document name, we parsed out the document bytes. It's a little big, it's not going to show it here. It updated that item to accepted. It added the attachments, which we can see in here. 200 means it worked. Here's all the details for that. And then we sent that email. So we got all the way through here. I annotated on here which ones involve humans and which ones are fully automated. So that's all of the Power Automate I was going to show. We can go into questions. I can talk about customizing SharePoint forms. Let's start with questions maybe because it's getting a little bit late. Anything in the chat that hasn't been answered yet?
Not yet.
So we'll open it up. Any questions? Do you guys want to see, there should be buttons in the attendee panel. Do you guys want to see a quick PowerApps thing, or are you good with just the Power Automate? If you click yes or no in the attendee panel. Do you get a DocuSign trial version? I think they may have a trial version, but they also have a sandbox account. So when you're developing solutions, you can consume envelopes very quickly. And so if you go to demo.docusign.net, I'm not sure where you sign up exactly. Let's see what this is. Demo.docusign.net account.d. Want you to sign up. Yeah, you can sign up for free. It looks like to a developer account. and then you can send, walk through real quick how to use Power Automate to do actions against an entire SharePoint list. So Elena, do you mean like how do you like iterate through all of the items in a SharePoint list and do something to them?
Exactly. Say I wanted to run through a list and archive everything that was over a specific date, running a workflow against to do its thing.
Okay. So, and then how would you want to kick that off? Would you want to start that on a scheduled basis or as on sort of on demand?
Either. I mean, I did one where I actually had a ribbon item that would go ahead and talk to Power Automate, but I never got it actually working. That was just my intention.
So for that, if I was going to do it with Flow,
to it, work in SharePoint.
Yeah, if I was going to do it in Flow, I probably wouldn't try to bind it to the list where, so inside of these list items, you have this thing called Automate, and there's different Power Automate functions. Now, real quick, jumping back to one of my earlier slides when I said the authentication is configured by the Flow author, usually, there are these things where Flow actions can run, I don't know if I put it in here, but there are things where you can have run-only users and then they get prompted for permission on the fly, and then it gives it runs under their context. But for something like what you're describing, I would probably just run it as an instant flow. If it's something you're going to do on a regular basis, if I was only going to do it once, I'd just write a JavaScript thing to do it. But what we'll do is we'll say manually configure a flow here, and so or manually trigger a flow, and that's basically just click a button. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. But I would then query all of my SharePoint. So if I type SharePoint here and I click on, what you see in the top part here is you see connectors. And then you see actions and triggers. Obviously we can't do a trigger because we're past the trigger stage. But I'm gonna go and get all of my SharePoint items. Now, how many items are we talking about here? Hundreds or thousands or?
4,800. We float just underneath the 5K limit.
All right, well, 5K is a view.
A lot there.
Yeah, 5K is a view threshold limit where you would probably hit. You probably hit it unless you added an index column and then filtered your query by that index column.
Which would work great if I was online in SharePoint, but we're actually doing quite a lot of stuff through Access's SQL query, and Access chokes up and grumbles the moment you've got to the 5K.
Fair. So all right. So what we're going to do here is items. I'm going to get items. And what I'm going to do is I would point it at a SharePoint list and then or SharePoint site and a SharePoint list. Now this is going to be very anticlimactic because there's not that much stuff. But what you can do inside of here is you can filter it. So if you want something that's over a certain date, so I can say, you know, modified is less than, and then put in a date of some kind. Or I can say, you know, amount is greater than, and then you know, 500. So you can filter your items in here. You can, and these are, I think it says in the help text, it says an OData filter query. So if you look up SharePoint OData operations, there's the first hit for me is use OData queries in SharePoint, and it gives you this little diagram down here which tells you how you can handle order by and filter different values, so less than or equal, greater than. And so this can let you decide which SharePoint items that you're going to get back out of that.
Can I use OR logic to merge 3 or 4 of those,
yeah,
or
yes,
do I need to do it within different steps?
No, so you'd say like field 1 EQ foo, or field 1 EQ bar. And you can even do this, and then you can say and. You can use parentheses and pair up your ands or ors.
It's simple, comfortable language as compared to, say, DAX, where or is messy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so there's different things in here, and you can have these be in parentheses and whatever. And there's a bunch of Stack Overflow expressions for like that. And there's date and time functions. So maybe you want to get everything that's over a certain date or anything like that. So those are those OData operators. So I would just get all of those back, and in this case, if I don't put any filter in here, it's literally going to get all of the items back out of that. And then the next step is like, maybe are you wanting to just change a property on them, or you're going to want to like put them into another list?
I've got workflows that operate when a specific field has been set to yes, so I would probably just change that one field's property saying, yep, now you're going to go off and be archived.
So I'm going to run this SharePoint action here called update item. And I'm going to go ahead and pick the same list. Now, this is a collection. So what I'm going to show you here is what happens when I drag ID up into here, because this came out of a collection of items. It's going to then throw it into a for each. So it's going to say apply to each. And I usually like to name these so I'll call it each offer, just so it's obvious which thing I'm doing, and update item, and then I can say set the status to voided.
If the date is over 4 weeks, yeah, understood.
Well, yeah, you would ideally do that on the query here. You could additionally, inside of here, you could then say, if this is over this or under that or whatever, then update the item. But that's going to make Flow do more work, and it's going to have to iterate over all those items that you don't care about. So it's always better in the terms of like trying to decouple your services to shift the burden of filtering and sorting to the server whenever possible, and that's what these fields let you do.
Or if you really need to use multiple steps, at least make the most restrictive stuff be the first one, yeah.
Exactly. And so, yep, I would have to put this in, but basically if I was to do this and then run, I mean, there's only one item in this list, but it would flip that to voided, and then you'd see it work. So that's kind of how that, go back to here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, great. Any other questions pop up?
I had one question that came up, which was whether this is being recorded and whether it's going to be available. And it is being recorded, just finishing up on that. And with Chris's permission, we will make it available. We'll have it posted on a YouTube channel, and we'll make it available to everybody.
I can DocuSign a permission.
I've got you on video already. That'll work.
So there's another question about SharePoint version requirements to work with Power Automate. It's SharePoint Online. On-prem, there might be ways to sort of make it work, but the native connectors aren't going to work in that way. Yeah, thanks, Ravi.
Oh, I have one if you have a moment.
Yeah.
I'd very much like to see what it would take to get Power Automate to push an output data set from a list to Microsoft BI. I can pull from Microsoft BI, but because of the limitations of the list, which has some calculated fields and such, Power BI is sitting there going, no, don't like it. Whereas if I could use Flow to push an export of the list with a subset of fields, that would work just fine.
Right. So what Power BI has is it's got triggers for, let's click on this. It's got triggers for when an alert hits, and it's got actions. You can add rows to a data set, or you can refresh a data set. So if this add rows to a data set, I don't have a connection to Power BI here. If that would work, then yeah, that should work. If not, then you could, if your data source was coming from like a SQL table or a data warehouse or something like that, then you could do it that way. Otherwise, if it's doable via API, then you could do it via a web service call.
I could probably do it through adding rows just by putting in anything that was updated as the rows that are added, and then on the Power BI side, setting a reference data set to filter only the most recent occurrence of each ID.
I'm not a Power BI expert by any means, but yeah, sounds like that would work.
Cool, I'll give that a try. That's actually a problem we've been staring at going around. Thank you.
Ravi's cleaning up on the Q&A for us there. Yes, you can use Teams sites, which are like SharePoint sites that are Office 365 and Teams enabled groups. All right.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining us. That was really interesting, and you got a lot of great resources here as well. And if you can shoot me the PowerPoint, I can.
I'll send it to you right after this.
Okay, fantastic.